Okay. I figure I can sort of start talking, the people gathering drinks. I hate punishing the punctual. Thank you very much for coming out in the weather. I know it's a challenge in Queensland. I'm a Queenslander myself. I know it can be tricky. My name's Michael Doneman, and before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country where we meet. They're elders past, present and emerging, as is our custom, and affirm the AMBO's commitment to engage meaningfully with the Indigenous people of our country. And this is the first of, it came about because we did some travelling this year, and part of that was professional travel, and I simply wanted to share some impressions with whoever wanted to turn up at the old ambulance station. I chair the board of the not-for-profit that runs this building, or this service and facility. But then getting to talk with some of the other members of the board, we had the idea that it would be useful to begin an occasional series of talks about what it is that we're setting out to do. As a board, as a governing body, and as, I guess, as the organisation as a whole, we're at a point where this not-for-profit is translating itself from a model of heavily government subsidised service delivery, a sort of welfare state model of cultural provision, towards what we generally call these days social enterprise, which has to do with earned income, still not-for-profit, but the notion of profit with a purpose, or profit for community benefit. And that involves a cultural change. And it's very important for those of us leading that we bring our constituency with us, we bring our community with us. And we had that idea already last year. We had an evening much like this called Catching Up with Ourselves. So the notion is to try to actually develop the discussion around these practices so that people don't misunderstand what it is that we're trying to achieve. I was just talking to a new friend, Simon Tannock, who is a scientist as well as an artist, about just this just recently. The notion is that creativity can be seen as a generic value in a community, certainly grounded in our case in the arts and the cultural industries, but can also be expressed in science, in politics, in social organisation, and etc. Creativity and innovation as generic values is one of the things that we want to focus on. Now, it's easy to say that. What might it look like? And how might it play out locally? What might we notice that tells us that that's what's happening out of the AMBO or out of a certain kind of practice, including arts practice, but as well including other practices as well. So that's what the point of this talk is about. It comes from that sort of direction from the board. And we were happy enough to happily, at the same time, discussing the visit to the Sunshine Coast by the CEO and principal of an alternative business school in the city of Aarhus in Denmark called the Chaos Pilots. And you'll hear more of this if you're on the mailing list or follow the Facebook page. So Krista Lidzelius will be visiting the Sunshine Coast on the back of a masterclass that he and his head of studies have been delivering in Sydney and Melbourne. So Sydney, Melbourne, Nambour. I love that, the rhythm of those three words together. And he will be giving a talk. So we're actually making this a linked up series of talks, in that case about what, again, cutting edge European practice in entrepreneurship education looks like. How do we create entrepreneurial spaces? What is an entrepreneur in the first place? What do we understand by that word if it's not Christopher Skase and the White Shoe Brigade on the Gold Coast? So I'm very pleased that this is the first of that series, which, as you can see, we're also recording so that it's available for people who don't come out in the weather. And I'm glad to see you tonight. Longish introduction. This is my day job. It's a company called Edgeware Creative Entrepreneurship, and my personal and life partner, who sold you a drink a minute ago, and I run this company. And we know it's working when our customers are doing this sort of thing. It's about entrepreneurship education. It is about our DNA is make money, have fun, change the world. Make money, is this commercially viable? Have fun, is this personally meaningful? Change the world, is this socially responsible? That combination of three values is what our business is about. We run courses, coaching, events. Part of our travel in Europe, we're in Europe for 6 weeks at the beginning of this year. Not quite as chilly as it is now, but chilly enough. And part of that was connected with Edgeware's business. We have some European partners that we're talking with. We gave some workshops. It's a good kind of, it's what we do and who we are is sort of the same thing, you know. So part of it was Ludmila's family in Slovakia. Part of it were connections in Italy, Belgium, Malta, and Hungary. And there's reasons for each one of those, which I won't go into. But in these two places, I thought, in Valletta, in Malta, and in Brussels, we came across ideas and practices, institutions that resonated for us somehow. And that's what I'm here to share. The Valletta Design Cluster in the capital of Malta, and the Transformer BXL Incubator Accelerator. I'm not actually sure what we would call it. I think part of what I want to talk about is what happens after incubators and accelerators and co-working spaces. What do places beyond just those models that we're perhaps a bit more familiar with, what might they look like? And what might the AMBO and places like the AMBO become along those lines? Anybody been to Valletta? Excellent. Loved it? Yeah. It's like carved out of this rock. It's a big rock in the Mediterranean. Everything's the same sort of sandy colour. It makes for some spectacular photographs in different lighting connections. And it's built like this. It was built in the 16th century by the Knights of St. John, the Military Order of St. John. So it's relatively recent. I mean, it has a history from Neanderthal times to the present. But Valletta is relatively recent in European terms. It's built very tight. The streets are built very narrow streets, a bit like an Italian opera. You know, people hang washing, shout at each other. Their little shops being in a tin of paint, a cigarette, and a newspaper, all at the same time. So it's a fort. They speak a language that's full of words like this. You know, double X's and H's with lines through them. They're actually Romanized Arabic. It's a version of Arabic. Quite an extraordinary place in many ways. The Valletta Design Cluster is built in streets like this. It's European culture, it's cultural capital this year, Valletta. So there's a lot of EU interest and a lot of EU energy and money being spent. And this is one of their flagship projects. It's an international incubator study space, semi-residential space and consciously international. It occurred to me, and it was relatively new to them, to talk about Valletta as a kind of Mediterranean Singapore in a way. You know, like Singapore, it doesn't actually produce anything. It has a water problem and etc., but it's sitting in a really strategic place. So how might transport in particular actually advantage them, their capacity to be a crossroads between the Middle East, Africa and Europe, for example. The complex is built in an old, I think it was one of the bishop's palaces. It's medieval architecture or Baroque architecture, so it goes up 3 floors, which means the walls on the bottom have to be this wide. There's nothing like reinforced concrete back then. Consequently, it's quite low slung, and lighting is an issue. There's several sort of design problems with the space. But as you can see, I mean, if you turn up and say you're interested, they give you a hard hat and a tour. They're incredibly open-ended in their consultation process, which is one of the things I want to emphasise. Right from the very beginning, it has not been just the business of experts. It's been the business of the community. And everybody has a go. Everybody's asked to give some input. A heavily Catholic culture. The mainstream culture with the Marian sects in particular. The place itself is down near the water in Valletta, which is a distinctly working class area. 30% youth unemployment, a lot of churn and right-wing extremist nationalism, surprise, surprise, and very concerned right from the beginning to avoid the gentrification of that neighbourhood. There's a politics in the consultation where they want to keep it down and dirty. They want to keep that sense of the Italian opera with the washing and the little girls calling to each other across the street and etc. A place where people live and work and unfortunately drive cars at insane speeds, very dangerously. And keep coming back to transport when I come to Valletta. What a wonderful sort of test bed for electric vehicles that stop this kind of insanity on the streets. So a lot of EU funding to build this sort of complex out as a design centre. What might that look like? What might its usefulness be? How might it be different from similar sort of incubators or crossroads in Europe and elsewhere? These are the drawings for the final space. Down here, a minute ago I showed you a picture of a narrow little alleyway. That's right through the middle of the place. Up at the head of it, it goes down, it's cantilevered down, from up here, cantilevered down towards the water. Up here at the head is a wellhead. Access to the water was strictly controlled by the Knights, and in common with a lot of Catholic Europe in particular, control of the water was actually a convenient means of social control in many ways. And they actually did construct the place on this notion of a wellhead with water that flows downwards and a garden. And I just want to remark on the garden because that will come up when we come to Brussels again later. A garden is seen to be a critical part of the design. This is one of the challenges for them because it's built in the way that it is. It risks being a little bit pokey, lots of different spaces. I'm not sure exactly how they're going to solve that problem, but you can see it sort of steps down the hill. They're going to open it up as far as they can right through. So there's light shafts built through the place so that you can actually look up into the sky and light the place naturally. That might lighten it up somewhere. Now, importantly, it was a consultative process. And it wasn't just government and a few Japanese and Scandinavian experts, although they did that. They used EU money to actually go to Japan and Scandinavia. You think design, you think Japan and Scandinavia often, you know. They did that, but they actually engaged from the beginning with the university, with the Centre for Environmental Education Research, with private sector designers, and with the networks, the business network, as well as their own government agencies which are expert and used to consulting with community, particularly those sectors of the community we might associate with working class culture, people who actually lived just across, 2 metres away from where the walls of the design centre were being built. These people all had a say and continue to have a say from pre-design through design and now through rapid construction. They're constantly going backwards and forwards. So it's an inspiring spot in a beautiful place, and I recommend it. And it's going to open soon. The pace of building by Australian standards is amazing, just amazing how quickly they're getting this thing built. So this is all text from various sources related to that. And these are, for me, the things that I took away, that I think about when I think about that experience. The catalysation of urban development. So the space is there, and I hope when I'm talking at this stage, and I'll do the same thing when I come to Transformer, that you're able to actually do some association with our own little town, our own little region, and our own little country. The development of the space is at one with the development of the environment where it finds itself. They're the same job. So decisions made in and about the space are also decisions that are relevant to its environment, its social, cultural, political, economic and built environments. This notion, a point I've already made, education, industry, community, research, policy. these things again are conflated. They're not quarantined one from each other. There, because there's a lot of money involved, the politics are right, cultural capital of the year and so on. There are political drivers in particular that reward this kind of consultation. I know it's not easy to do this sort of thing, but when you do, you kind of create this gestalt, you create this group energy that's greater than the sum of its parts. And each one of those sectors brings their own perspective. The academics bring their gift for words and history and philosophy and reasoning. The politicians make things happen. The artists and creatives bring insight and inspiration and human qualities and affiliation and like that. The contribution of design to social and economic well-being. Again and again, here and elsewhere, when we actually use that riff, make money, have fun, change the world. We were there 4 years ago, talked about it the same way, and they were interested. But now I feel they're really interested. They actually don't use, in my experience, the term social enterprise very often in the way that we use it quite commonly here. So they'll talk about responsible business or business that contributes. Is that your experience, that social enterprise is not necessarily a thing? We have a couple of token Europeans, in our audience.
Depends, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially, I think, because, so, just to give you a context, I was born in Germany, grew up there and everything, but my parents are originally from Croatia, so, like, it's also southeastern and Europe, and I think, like, the eastern part, or, like, very southern Europe, they are lacking that social side, because they see, like, always Germany, France, like, having, like, a very good economic developed system, but then they are like lacking behind, so they're thinking like, oh, we need that economic development, and then they kind of lose this social values or like traditional things. So you say like, oh, let the kids play and shout and have the clothes in the cities from one window to the next hanging. Yeah.
Okay. We were talking before about the way that language itself conditions the way we think about things, and it was interesting. I was just talking to somebody recently from Bhutan, and I gave some workshops to some Bhutanese scholars a few years ago on the topic of social enterprise, and it was kind of interesting for me as the workshop proceeded that they were just not getting the term social enterprise. And when I interrogated that a bit, turned out that it was because they actually couldn't culturally perceive business which was not socially responsible. So, and it made me think, well, we talk about social enterprise as distinct from enterprise, and we're making certain assumptions about what enterprise is, that we have to distinguish, we have to hive off social enterprise or responsible business from what we think is mainstream business. We actually make that assumption, So it's very important. This is what academics can do. They can actually help us name these distinctions and these tensions and these opportunities that come from this. Well, on that term, educational institutions and initiatives. I mean, working with education has this function, but it also has the function of, it has a commercial and business application and function. Education is our third largest export in this country, after iron and coal, So it goes coal, iron, education. Particularly in the East Asian marketplace, but generally speaking. So if we're looking at building this as a social enterprise, we have to be thinking about education. We have to be thinking about education online, because we're a long way away from the rest of the world. Proximity to the resident community. They want to develop that centre without gentrifying the neighbourhood, without squeezing out the workers, and etc. This is a challenge, I think, for the AMBO. I think we should be proud of the rural working class and current battler position of the town that we live in. And we should keep that, because that, apart from anything else, distinguishes us from what's going on down the beach and what's going up on the range. What is it for us to actually own, recognise, celebrate and keep that, providing a few jobs in the meantime? I'm not saying keep things broke and keep the shops closed, but it is about keeping the spirit of that barefoot, bum out of the pants, bootstrapping culture. And they paid for it with a lot of European money. Those French and German euros in particular that poured into Valletta. They couldn't do it without that. They couldn't do it without the political reality of the EU, and the French and the Germans in particular. So that's Malta. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2 is Belgium. And for a beer drinker, you probably know by looking at me that I quite like a drink or two, a beer or two. I was just knocked out, you know, like supermarkets with shelves full of Belgian beer, the best beer in the world. My God, what a heaven, you know, for a start. And there's this culture just on the French and German riff, you know, the Belgians were telling me, you know, we exist to keep the French and the Germans apart. That's one of the reasons we exist, you know. And my take generally of the Belgians was that was right. They actually have what I think of as the best of the French, the best of the Germans, and the best of the Dutch. There's nothing not to like about that. It's expressed in the beer and the bread and the chocolates, of course. I won't talk about the waffles and the friture, the chips, you know. These people love to eat and they love conversation. They love conviviality. Who knew? You know, Belgium was not on my bucket list, you know, but what an extraordinary experience we had in that place. So we did some work in Ghent, and then we went on introducing, just networking. They say, you've got to see this place called Transformer. It's not in central Brussels, it's in a northern suburb. It's moved here, so the concept's about 7 years old. They've been in the present site for about 2 years. They were part of a big barn building in a disused sports centre in another fringe part of the city. The place looks from the outside like a pretty cool co-working, collaboration sort of space. It's quite large, there's a U shape, around a permaculture garden, and that's one of the first things you notice about it. This thing about gardens on the roof of the Valletta Centre, and in this place, the garden is used as a metaphor, but also as a place to just grow tucker, and a place to go and sit in the green. So it's a sort of U around a permaculture garden, and that was the first part of the thing that they developed, the garden, which in itself is a permacultural principle. The first thing you build is the garden. The second thing you build is the kitchen, which the garden services. Things go out from the garden and the kitchen. That's a permacultural principle. They were interested to learn that permaculture is an Australian idea. They didn't actually know that. So the spaces inside are pretty cool. They have an agreement with a resident design company who provide design services on a sort of rolling basis. So there's large co-working spaces, there's discrete offices, there's lock-up spaces, there's meeting spaces, there's kitchens. Again, just on that riff of the Belgian hospitality and conviviality, food is very important. Not so much just the food itself, although it's pretty good, but the act of sitting down and sharing food. They have 2 kitchens and they're building a 3rd in this space at the moment, and they all have really good coffee, really good beer in the fridge, and really good food available fairly cheap. Put this here for our recording people today. They actually have a vodcast studio that has a sort of slit on it at the side. So I was walking past and somebody was recording, he sort of just did this, and then came out. Somebody said a long time ago, when I first did the Chaos Pilots actually in Aarhus, somebody said you can tell the quality of an education institution by how long it takes somebody to approach you when you step through the door. You step across the threshold, you step through the gate and just look around. And if it's a working, if the thing is working, somebody will approach you and say, "G'day, can I help?" or whatever. That happened when you used to go through the Chaos Pilots, this sort of tight spiral staircase in the European style. I remember stepping into the little sort of vestibule before that, and almost immediately a student asked me, you know, greeted me, recognised me as a stranger, greeted me, and asked me where I could go. That's what happened here. These guys saw strangers walking through the hallway, they stopped what they were doing, popped out, just said hello, you know. It has security implications, but more about conviviality and a sense of ownership. So these are 2 of the resident companies that do podcasts and vodcasts out of the space. Just thought I'd put that in for you guys. They They have, we met the guy that runs this, a program called Impact 101, which is peer-to-peer acceleration. Again, very community-oriented, very convivial, very affiliatory. There's a sense of belonging to this, which is based, again, they would talk about sustainable innovation, sustainable business, not social enterprise, it's just business with a conscience. And these characteristics, health, quality education, gender equality, these characteristics are part of their DNA. So this is a startup program that runs once a month. People come and pitch and their ideas and meet each other and work out relationships, which the organisation facilitates as a follow-through from those meetings. So the organisation is a kind of dating agency in that sense. You know, it's a place where you go to meet the people you need to meet to do what you want to do, and then there are facilities for that beyond that. Now this is the part that's the real kicker. This is the one that really sets this apart. When I talked about being post-incubator, post-co-working and etc., they actually have storage, manufacturing, light manufacturing and storage facilities. These are being built at the moment. So this will all be sort of robotic and etc. So you can take, and I saw a little gizmo that had been through this process. It's a wireless computer speaker for children that has little characters that can be 3D printed, but they actually are sort of little like chess pieces that you can move around on the surface of the speaker, and it actually changes, it talks to the speaker, and each one has a little USB port, so you can actually put different kinds of music into these characters and they can talk to each other musically, and you can physically shift them around. This is for 4 to 6 year olds, something like this. Now those people had the idea. They came and used, I think the Fab Lab, the MIT franchise Fab Lab, to actually trial it and etc. and make a prototype. They manufacture it there, not the speakers themselves, but they 3D print the little figures, and they store it and ship it from there. So it's a one-stop shop from ideation through to actual distribution, commercialization and distribution. Now as an educator I'm really fascinated by that, because you can actually hang a whole skill set across each one of those stages. And by virtue of co-locating them in one place, you can get them talking to each other. So when I have an idea for a product, wouldn't it be useful to know how I might actually manufacture that product, what it would cost, how I would price it, and how distribution would factor in that, how I would actually store and distribute the product at the end of its cycle, at the end of that production cycle. I think this is where things are going to go. I'm not suggesting we're going to be able to do that at the AMBO. I mean, they have, I don't know how many thousand square feet in Transformer to do this sort of stuff. Like, it's just constantly being built. You know, you turn a corner and there's another corridor and another build, and you know, like I say, they're building another kitchen. They need a third kitchen. Of course they do. I'm not sure that we can do that here, but in terms of a regional proposition, I think it's possible for the AMBO to negotiate with other providers, with other facilities in our region and join up some dots along this line. So we can value add to each one of those stages: ideation, prototype or experimentation, prototyping, production, distribution. You know, actually add those things up and add value to those and hang education off. You'd expect an educator to say that, of course, but to hang training and education off that, to trade on that, to actually make that a unique, saleable function of the ecology, and this is the first time I want to use that word, but I'll use it a few times now, of the region, the innovation ecology of the region. Lights up at night, looks really cool. Just love this idea of this sort of inverted idea, you know, bing! It's this sort of upside down light bulb, looking at the light bulb from underneath. Conception, competition is taken over by co-creation. It's a good socialist mantra. How do you make it work? Well, they make it work. Innovation, entrepreneurship, there's specific notions of what those mean. Both of those terms are thrown around a lot these days. They have a very grounded notion. Impact 101 gives us some idea of what they mean when they use these terms. social innovation, a human-centric way of working, and a positive impact on Brussels. Once again, they're aware of their physical environment, they're aware of their locale, they're aware of their built environment and the physical, social, cultural, political, economic environment that surrounds it. By entrepreneurs, for entrepreneurs, and this is something I want to actually emphasise. In the same way as I brought up the kicker slide, the kicker animation in the Valletta panel like this, and emphasised that there was a lot of EU money that went into this. In the case of Transformer, it's private. It's entirely private. The whole thing has no government money in it. So I met one of the two guys that are partners in this. I don't think either of them is 40 yet. It's debt funded. Now, that's a very practical idea that I brought home from the AMBO, for the AMBO, you know? Even though we're a not-for-profit, why is it we have to sit on our hands and wait for bloody government to do stuff, to make money available, to change their policy or whatever? Why should we not act like entrepreneurs if we're talking about social enterprise, you know? Why should we not go on the front foot and do what entrepreneurs do? Maybe take a few risks, calculate some risks, but actually lead government, you know, rather than the other way around. This is part of the sort of cultural change that I'm talking about. Why should we not only make our own money, but use the money that we have to leverage more money in true business style, you know, and drive the business in the way that we think it should go. And if it happens that government happens to be travelling that way too, then terrific. If not, then we'll make it work ourselves. It's a cultural thing. We have two beehives whose job is to curate the garden's ecosystem in the same way as we curate a community of entrepreneurs. So how do we actually develop a community of practice? That's the educationese, you know, so people who are united, not necessarily because they agree on the same things, but because they practice in the world, they do stuff in the world in a certain way. It becomes a community of practice, not a community of artists, a community of engineers, a community of this or that, a community of practice, which is creative, innovative, socially responsible. So this is the stuff I think we can use. Do you know the word bootstrapping, by the way? I've had to explain this a few times. I just sort of assume people know. A bootstrap is a little tag on the end of their boot that you use to pull your bloody boots on, you know? So to bootstrap something is to pull your boots on yourself, rather than sort of get somebody to put it on for you, you know, a servant or what have you. What can we use? Catalyse. So I used the word, and the word catalyst has come up before. So not just do stuff ourselves, but engage with networks. Engage as a member, a creative member of an innovation ecosystem. Put people together, become a dating agency, you know? Introduce people to the people they need to meet. The collaboration of our community, our membership, and growing our membership, which is by itself a discussion. Education and industry, and I just made the point of a community of practice. It's not about apps. It's not about techno-fetishism. You know, this word innovation is thrown about, and there's a narrative of high risk, fast growth, early exit, tech-based businesses, you know, as if any kind of Silicon Valley is in any way possible in this country ever, you know? There's a romance around technology. Every single business, every single 21st century business is a tech business. Of course it is, particularly if you live in a tiny country at the end of the world, as we do in Australia. You can't not have technology somehow. You can't not have apps somehow in your business. To pretend that that's what it's about is a mistake. You know, it's short-sighted, it's fashionable. Whoa! It's short-sighted, it's fashionable, and it doesn't work. We have to behave and actually become entrepreneurs. Not servants of government, not some ersatz government agency, but actually entrepreneurs, with all that that means, which means bootstrapping. We can't wait for government, we can't wait for Big Brother or Big Sister to tell us what we want to do, what we need to do. We need to do what entrepreneurs do, which is identify a need or an opportunity, find a market for that, and bring the idea to that market at a markup, you know, in a socially responsible kind of way. That's what entrepreneurs do, you know. They don't sit there and wait for the winds of policy to change so they can write a really killer grant application. They might do that, you know, I mean, they take their bootstrap. They don't say no to anything, but the first thing is a mindset thing. How do you develop a mindset? How do you develop the constant questioning, where is the opportunity, or what is the problem that we can bring our resources to? So that's what I think these people are doing. They're designing and then executing creative innovation ecosystems. Mr. Nakatsu is the head designer of the Shinkansen 500, the latest version of the Japanese bullet train. Travels at more than 200 kilometres an hour. Do you know this story? Yeah. He turns out to be, they have problems. There's a number of problems with this. Comes out of a tunnel, creates a sonic boom. It pushes air in front of it so hard and so fast, compresses it, that it creates this enormous crash, you know, which people living near the train line don't like very much. So Mr. Nakatsu happens to be a bird watcher. And this is sort of getting towards the final image I want to leave with you, okay? He brought his knowledge of three birds, the flight patterns, the feather patterns of owls, which have to fly silently in order to locate and succeed in capturing their prey, the beak of a kingfisher, which is designed very specifically not to get in the way of the kingfisher's dive into the water, so the aerodynamics of the beak, and the feather pattern of the breast of a particular penguin, which had to do with not so much the design of the train itself, but I'm not sure what the word is, the catenary, which joins it up to the electricity grid, okay? Now, he put all those things into practice in the design of the Shinkansen 500. I should hand over to you now, you probably know this better than me. And it solved the problem. No more sonic boom coming out of tunnels, that sort of thing. But it also saved, I think, 30% of the energy expended on getting that object to that speed and back to a still point again, you know. So the message for this, if I'm arguing that we need to design creative innovation ecosystems, we don't have to assume that we know all the answers ourselves. We don't have to assume, this goes back to the notion of being a catalyst. We don't have to pretend that we can drive this, that we know the answer, that we know what the future is. We can actually ask ourselves, has this been done before? In the millions of years of evolution of organic life on this planet, has this problem, whatever the problem is, come up before? The problem, for example, of people and organisms in groups. We are a community of practice ourselves. We want to build a community of practice ourselves. We want to locate that in an ecosystem of creativity in our little working class part of this little part of Australia. So how might we do this? A system is not the sum of the behaviour of its parts, it's a product of their interactions. So we don't just add up the bits that make the system work. We actually look at the spaces between the bits. We ask ourselves, this is why food and conviviality, conversation, relationship are so important, you know, and it's another thing we can learn from the Indigenous people in this country. How do we create the relationships? How do we create the conversations between the right kinds of people? So find the right kinds of people, identify the kind of conversation and resource that. Then stand back and see what happens, you know. So the product of their interactions. This is my own little mind map that I came home with. And I didn't set out to draw a tree, but it looked like a tree in the end to me. It's a generative sort of notion that put together things. There's a little colour code that sits in there. There's dotted lines. I don't expect you to understand it. It's for me. But it had this kind of flow to it. It had this sort of sense. You've probably seen these pictures. What is it that makes a flock of birds do this, make this kind of pattern? What is it that makes a shoal of fish behave the way that they behave? It's not insect intelligence, it's not termite intelligence or ant intelligence where there's a kind of hardwired capacity to build nests or react to the sun or magnetic waves in a particular way. It's a different kind, in my view, a different kind of intelligence. And I want to leave you with that image because I'm not sure exactly what that means in terms of how we apply it. But I think organic imagery, the notion of growing an innovation ecosystem as distinct from building one, is the way to go. For your interest, the only thing in the Commonwealth Games that I'm interested in this time around is the netball final. Australia has played New Zealand. Do you know what the Australian team is called, by the way? The Australian netball team? The Diamonds. I know that now. I didn't know that a few days ago. When the Diamonds play the Kiwis in the final, as they will, far and away the two best netball teams on the planet, they will actually be repeating. They've done that for the last 4, maybe 5 Commonwealth Games. And they've always been really close matches, down to 1 or 2 goals, and the Kiwis have always beaten us. Until last time in Glasgow, the Commonwealth Games. Why? The Diamonds hired a mathematician, a guy who was a sports psychologist, but he was into maths, and he was into shoaling fish and flocking birds. And he created some maths by an algorithm that allowed him to observe the way netball teams played. Well, any team played, but he was hired by the Diamonds, so he applied it to netball. And it wasn't so much about creating strategies for the Aussie team, it was more about reading the Kiwi team, you know. So he applied this algorithm, they applied it in the coaching team, and the Kiwis, they beat them by 14 goals. So from sort of very on the line for 12 years to a breakaway win, particularly in the second half. And I heard an interview with the Kiwi captain afterwards, and she said, we didn't know what to do. They knew where we were going to throw the ball. And that was the effect of the algorithm. It wasn't so much being better players, but knowing the opponent better. And he did that by applying this sort of maths that involves how fish swim in groups, how birds fly in flocks. You know, there's certain rhythms in 4 dimensions that apply to these groups, you know. But after a while, if you're an individual bird, you know, like the ambo, or like one of us involved in the ambo, you're not particularly worried about that. You know, you're just going, as they say, with the flow. So ultimately the takeaway is let's grow our local ecosystem, our innovation ecosystem. Let's plug it into and catalyse our regional ecosystem. That's my message, and we're just short of 60 minutes, which means there might be some time for a comment or a question, if you'd like to make that. And our technologised team is geared up to even pick it up, I believe, despite the fact that it's raining outside. Is there a comment or question about any of this? Yeah. Yeah.
So this could be the light manufacture, the display, the retail, the makeway labs, so the maker space might be further down the track.
Yeah.
So there's a wonderful opportunity with that, particularly as the customers understand that it's going potentially further than what's.
Yeah, it's extending right down to Coolum along the old tracks. Not the train itself, but, you know, bike track and etc. I think that's an excellent point, and that's again the point of logistics and transport at Transformer. I mean, Amazon and Google and Apple and now Facebook are going into transport for a reason, you know. It's not about going to cars, trucks and ferries, it's going into computers that move and the computers that carry things around, the Internet of Things, you know. I'm teaching a class at USC this semester, and I want to bring the students here for some of the workshops, and transport's an issue for them. You know, they're students, they don't have cars. And I didn't know whether Suncoast buses, when they come into Nambour and etc. But one of them said to the other, one said, "Where's Nambour?" And the other one said, "Oh, that's that place you go to get to Brisbane." It's the railhead to go to Brisbane. If you're a German student on the Sunshine Coast, that's what Nambour means to you, a transport centre, you know? And I know some of these students, these architecture students, commented on the fact that what's the first thing you see when you get off the train at Nambour station, you know, the arse end of C Square, the people hanging around the methadone clinic, and, you know, I mean, welcome to Nambour, my goodness. So I think connectivity, John, is absolutely critical for the whole future of this place.
But in this sort of this place we're living now with networks and everything else, I mean, you've already had a maker space here. If you want more space, there's acres in and around Nambour of space. Factory space, shop space,
Yep.
space. So much empty space, it's unbelievable.
Yep.
I just don't see that you can't have a distributed. If you want to make a space to be added on to the ammo, you can find a maker space and put it on a factory or something
Yep.
else that can be networked together. That isn't the stumbling block. I think the stumbling block is people being prepared to work together rather than concentrating on their own little bit.
Yep.
Everyone's doing this. You know, we've had a lot of discussion. I've had the pleasure to be on the periphery of the reviving Nambour thing, and there's some pretty heated sort of comments on the business organisation that represents Nambour, what they do and don't do and won't do and will do and everything else. But I think what I'm taking away from this is, and coming from a party area myself, you've got a thing going on over there where people are much more prepared to work together. Whereas my apprehension, what happens here is that people want to run to empire,
Yeah.
and people actively resist working together. And mainly
Yeah.
for the fear that the minute you open your mouth about your idea, suddenly it becomes somebody else's idea and they've got it before you've got half a chance to do anything with it.
Yeah. I hear two things in that.
Rather than a facilities thing.
I hear two things in that. One is the necessity to create a business case around a makerspace or a distribution, a logistics service or something. The second is cultural change, and that's the hardest because culture is subtle, wet, human, complex. It doesn't happen overnight. I can just think like an entrepreneur and suggest that it's about leading by example. So if people can actually see a model that works in terms of employment, new business, any metric you want to put on it, then they'll want some of that, you know? Thanks, Tony.
My experience of the Brisbane hackerspace, which I went to a few times when we lived down there, was very much that when they set up, they basically just put a call out to their entire networks, and next thing they had so many machines, they had some huge laser printers and lathes and all of these tools that has been sitting on the edge of a workshop and nobody's done anything with.
Yeah.
And then it was just basically that easy structure of I've learned how to do it, so I know how to use the drill press, so I can teach you, and on it goes down. And that sharing of knowledge and as one of the old farts in the room compared to the guys that were populating that and girls that were populating that space, I would agree with you that there is that sort of, it's my idea and my thing, but it was just total sharing. Everyone was just sitting around at the table and throwing ideas down.
Yeah.
And if we can make a business out of it, cool, but really it's just about sharing. And that was really heartwarming for me in that space, and there's no reason it can't be dragged up here. And I also like the idea of what you were saying about what Nambour is and what the populace is, because I get frustrated with the ideas of apps being. To me, it's about things, and the people who make things are the tradies and that part of society, and that's more about what's here than what's in the ritual. So it's this is well positioned.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they used to. My grandparents used to have like I don't know what it's called, a pit. You'd drive your car over it so you could work from underneath. I mean, that's part of the ramp just near where we're standing, and we don't want to lose that. The physical nature of tinkering with stuff. Bricolage in French, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, just make it work, So you end up with something that might look like a Mad Max car, but it actually works, You know, it actually runs on the petrol that you've got. I think that's absolutely right. Thank you. You wanted to say something, Anna, a minute ago?
It was more of a question, I don't know really where I want to go with it, but because you went to Valletta and you said what it used to be like a cathedral or a church place, or what?
A fort, more than anything else. A fort, military.
Yeah, and what, was it still used?
Oh, this particular building?
Yeah.
Oh, it was a bishop's palace, I think. It was
so it was empty most of the time.
yeah, and disused. It was falling apart. There's all sorts of structural challenges with it. People didn't know what to do with it. A bit like the Ambo, you know.
Yeah.
It's like,
We
what do you?
found actually a calendar on the wall which was only 8 years old. Supporters were there. And the community around knew about that. So it was kind of safe. But now,
And these people had names too. So there was Giorgio, who'd been squatting there, and he was now not there. He was living, he was a homeless person, you know. But everybody knew Giorgio, you know. He actually had a function and a role in that place. Nobody was saying, let's get rid of him, you know.
No, it just struck me there, let's not get rid of it. Nambour is what Nambour is.
Mm.
We can't dress it up with bells and whistles, can't we? And there is a charm, and it is the historic centre of the Sunshine Coast.
Mm.
And I think often the perception is built towards the new, shiny, bright things we're building, and we are doing some amazing things on the Sunshine Coast, but that's not to say that there's not a place for the humble, simple places that people still need to be.
Absolutely.
And I think Nambour is still in essence a community.
Yeah.
And I think that you're completely on the right track. Communities and practice are very close to my heart, so it struck me when I saw you referring to those, because I think that is how everything gets done.
Yeah. I think, you know, it's not mass market, but there is a market for the authentic, the bespoke, the one-off. You know, look at hipsters. Hipsterism is not a pendulum, you know, it's actually a transformation in what people are valuing as consumers. We want to hear the story of the product. We want to see the face behind the making of the product. And if the product's one-off or limited or special or Nambour versus blah, then we're ready to pay a little bit more for it. You know, because we've got the story, the IP enriches the product, the experience economy. We talk about all this stuff.
And Nambour does have the story.
Yeah.
It's a true characteristic, it does have the story.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to hear you talk about that, because that's the one thing that drove me to buy here in Nambour rather than the coast, because I'm not into bright shiny new. I like things that are a bit broken and interesting that you can play with, you can pull apart, you can put it back together or just leave it as it is and go, that's how it is. But I'm really inspired by that relational interaction. That's the foundation of the success of those systems, because the thing that strikes me about Nambour is that you have the capacity to have relationships because the people are real. They're not just consumed by, you know, the Pleasantville picket fence and, you know, the perfect driveway and the perfect this and the perfect that. They're interested in the colour and the difference and the, you know, the duality of things that is Nambour. You know, it's an interesting place and it's really a beautiful space from my perspective to birth out of something that is unique and creative. Rather than manufactured and mass-produced and acceptable to everybody. This is about acceptable to those who accept it. It's not an everybody situation. That's what I love that. It's really inspiring about the product of the interactions.
It seems to me you can also define it by what it's not as well. So it's all those things. There's a positive, and it's stated positively, which is terrific. It's also possible to say, well, it is not a mini Gold Coast, which is what Maroochydore is turning into, which in itself is a mini Miami, you know? I mean, you go into some of these places, including some of the co-working and incubator spaces, you could be anywhere in the world, You know, I call that airport architecture. You know, every airport pretty much looks like every other airport. So who cares? Where's the sense of ownership in that? By nature, I'm just passing through. You know, there's no sense of real place. The one exception of that from the same trip was Munich Airport. For some reason, have you been to Munich Airport? It works. It's seamless. There's these little, it's vast and, you know, security, all of that stuff. But there's all these little niches where you can just sort of sit down and have a really good salad or a real beer. I didn't want to go on about beer. Some reason it just works and there's no hassle, there's no rush, there's no Heathrow about it. I don't know how they've worked that, but it's worked. But, sorry?
It's about the beer, the pretzels, I'm sure.
Yeah, having a couple of beers, everything looks a little bit rosier. The cash flow is rental. So casual rental for at co-working rates, office space, events. When we were there was the first day of a 2-day seminar that the 3 phone company was running for their staff. I think the space that we're in, since we've been refurbishing this part of the AMBO, lends itself to small to medium corporate style events, which I think we should be renting out at commercial rates, which will enable us to subsidise other rents. That's cash flow.
Is there a membership sort of base where people come in and just tap into sort of?
Yeah. And then sort of semi-permanent offices, discrete lockable spaces.
And their expansion that we saw there was more so than the kitchen, was that more rental?
And I think that's speculative as well. So I don't know them well enough to sort of, you know, it's private, so they're obviously not going to just advertise the business case. But if I was them, I'd be thinking about taking points in the businesses, like the kids speaker business that I talked about. So we'll, rather than, you know, we'll charge you a discount rent for our facilities, but our support will actually come at the cost of 10% gross of your company and a seat on your board. That's what I would do if I was them. That's medium to long term though. That's not going to turn into money straight away, and some of those businesses are going to fall over. But you know, Juki, the kids book, the kids business, the speaker I told you about, looks like earning money. You know, I don't know how many have fallen over though before that came up. So I think that's medium long term, and that's a kind of an investment decision. So we're, in the case of the AMBO, we're landlords, but we could also see ourselves as investors.
So you want to go out on the roof?
It makes me think that one of the next things we should renovate is that kitchen, though. That kitchen and that middle space possibly as an eating, meeting, convivial space, you know? And kind of work out from there in terms of the internals. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for coming.